Hello and welcome to this special podcast which gives you an insight into the recent business and tenancy training events run by the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs and Savills, and will hopefully take you a step forwards in terms of thinking about your future career in food and farming. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the final two sessions of training had to be cancelled, and so we thought we'd bring you this virtual insight instead. My name is Ben Eagle, and I'm joined today by Ashley Lilly, Director of Agribusiness at Savills, who heads up the food and farming team across the west of England, and Georgina Sweeting, a food and farming consultant, also with Savills, based at their York office. So if you're thinking about applying for a tenancy, if you're joining the family farm business, or if you have a food or farming-based business idea that you'd like to launch into reality, over the next half hour, we are here to help you on your journey. Don't forget to take a look at the business and tenancy training presentation, which you'll find on the same page where you found this podcast. That presentation has lots more detail, which is aimed at helping you to get to the next step on your journey. Savills are also offering a free 30-minute Zoom session on business and tenancy issues with a Savills business consultant. Ashley and Georgina will be giving more details on this later. Ashley and Georgina, thank you for joining me for this today. 2020 has been a year unlike any other, I think we can say that, with the pandemic ushering in a lot of change. On top of this, due to Brexit, we're also heading into a new agricultural policy framework with the Agriculture Bill passing through Parliament. We're going to focus a lot on the Ag Bill today and its potential consequences for younger farmers and new entrants. But I wonder if we can start by reflecting on the potential impact of COVID and the economic impact of the lockdown on opportunities so far as new entrants to the industry, prospective farm tenants and next generation farmers might be concerned. For Ashley, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. First off to say, we all hope that COVID issues will be short-lived, but I don't think we can get away from the fact that they have been disruptive for farming and rural businesses. I mean, perhaps one example would be the impact on milk sales early on in the shutdown when fast food chains and the catering sector basically ground to a halt. And many farmers were faced with, very difficult decisions about what to do with their surplus milk. Having said that, we all hope that things will turn around. I suppose the thing that I would focus on is the business plans and business planning. I would always say that having a plan is better than not having a plan. And even if you're sort of knocked sideways by something like COVID, at least you've got a plan to refer back to see what you need to do to get back on track.
Yeah. I mean, Georgina, are there any positives to draw out of this time?
I think there have been a few positives. We've seen a lot more focus at the beginning of the pandemic on shopping and sourcing locally produced food. Make sure you're buying food, where it's come from in the food chain in that sense. And we've seen through Savills, we've had a colleague with a farm vending machine, and he's done really well out just selling produce from the farm, potatoes and things on the outside of Edinburgh. And that's been really busy, and they've had a huge uptake from the local population. And hopefully things like that will continue.
Let's turn to the training sessions that you carried out pre-COVID. What were these sessions all about? What did you focus on, and who were they aimed at?
I mean, really, it was about posing the question to young farmers: are you fit and ready for business, or are you ready to start a business? And that really centred around: have you initiated discussions either within the family, so that probably not as formal as a succession plan, but having early discussions with family members as to what the future shape of the business might look like.
Yeah.
Talking to the trusted advisors, and not doesn't necessarily mean professional advisors like ourselves or accountants, but just friends and neighbours whose counsel and advice you would trust. And for those looking to raise finance, it's a conversation or an early conversation with the bank manager, which I'm sure we'll pick up on a little bit more later on.
Yeah, absolutely. A key relationship for everyone, I'm sure. Let's introduce the Agriculture Bill and talk about that. Listeners may have a broad awareness of the direction we're heading in terms of moving from a system of payments based on land area to a system of payments for public goods. But to what extent has the Ag Bill been designed with the next generation in mind? So, for example, the most recent format of the CAP had specific measures to support younger farmers. Might this be continued post Brexit, but into the new system? Ashley?
I think the first thing to say in response to that, Ben, is it is still early days. For anyone that's sort of following the progress of the Agricultural Bill, it now sits with the House of Lords. We expect that it will pass into law later in the autumn. But it's really all about giving the government broad powers with the detail yet to be sort of sorted out. So in essence, the full design isn't there yet. There are references to new entrants and young farmers, and obviously we can sort of look back to the sort of the specific things that have been designed within the Common Agricultural Policy that impact and benefit young farmers and new entrants, but really it's how much of that is carried through into the new agricultural bill and what UK and even devolved governments decide to do specifically for younger farmers.
I mean, so Georgina, still quite a lot of uncertainty. Well, a lot of uncertainty, and we're recording this at the end of July, but the bill itself still has a way to go.
Yeah, I think they are hopeful that the bill will be passed by the end of summer, but as Ashley said, we still know very little of the actual detail.
I mean, are there any major new opportunities, do you think, that you can see for younger farmers and new entrants?
So one of the major ones is the concept of delinking payment. So the idea that retiring farmers and tenants will be able to take a lump sum of their basic payment money up front, really, and then whoever is actively farming the land can do that themselves and take the land, that area in the way that they want to take it. So hopefully that will free up a bit of land for new tenants, younger entrants, people looking to get into share farming and that sort of thing. But there will need to be added incentives for people looking to retire, from tax savings and potentially a match service for joint ventures. So you could log online somewhere and see if there's any retiring farmers in your area, and maybe have a meeting with them and link up with them that way.
Let's focus on tenancies, those looking to apply for a tenancy and how the Ag Bill might impact on a prospective application. I mean, broadly, what might a landlord be looking for moving forwards that they might not have been before Brexit? Ashley?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Ben. I mean, I would go back to probably what I would have said before Brexit, and that is, as a good business plan matched with entrepreneurial spirit. I suppose we do know, both post-Brexit and post the agricultural bill and subsidy reform, is that we can't rely on subsidy income to support farming businesses. Now, I have to say, in the various events that we've run and my dealings with young farmers, they're very aware of that. You know, that perhaps is that sort of generational change and acceptance that the business has to stand on its own merits and abilities and can't rely on subsidy. I mean, other things that I think we'll see. I mean, we've already had the TRIG report and TRIG reforms to farm business tenancies, which should make it easier for new tenants to diversify. And clearly that is a direction of travel post 2020, whether it's Brexit, COVID or what have you.
Yeah. What are some common pitfalls for tenancy applicants? And I suppose that goes for the whole of time. It doesn't have to be necessarily now, but could be in the past as well.
No, of course, there are quite a few. Quite often, sitting on the sort of the landlord side of the desk, appraising tenant submission. I mean, generally, yes, we see some very good submissions, but equally the pitfalls, people perhaps not being as well prepared as they could have been. Sometimes even as basic as not really understanding or not actually having sat down and read what it is that the landlord is asking for as part of an application or a tender. Yeah. Understandably, it's quite easy to be overambitious in terms of the affordability of a rent and taking on a new farm. Quite often that goes with too much focus on what the market rent should be rather than what an individual can actually afford to pay. So that, again, that's really about working through your budgets and having a clear business plan. Mm-hmm. And again, in terms of clarity, being absolutely clear-minded and focused in terms of what it is you're trying to achieve for your future business and your long-term career progression, you know, and that might be about what you want to do in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. And I suppose sort of the advice that comes out of all of that is that you do need to be resilient if your tender's not accepted. And, you know, the old adage, if at first you don't succeed, try again, does come to mind.
Yeah, I think actually just pausing on that point, that's a really important one, isn't it? Actually, that idea of resilience, especially if you're starting out, or this might not be your first application, but if this is really what you want to be doing, keep at it and keep refining and keep learning.
Exactly.
What might help a prospective tenant stand out from the competition, Georgina?
So just touching on what Ashley was saying then, really, of the business plan, so you know your objectives, and including that business plan a realistic budget where you can show to the landlord that you know your costs and you know your output and you've been very realistic about the rent you've put forward, and to show really that it might not be the highest rent on the table, but at least thought it through. And also, I think a really positive outlook helps. Go in there with a positive mindset and be enthusiastic about the challenge in front of you. And I think things like that will help you stand out.
Obviously, opportunities have diversified quite a bit in recent years, and I'm sure this has caused plenty of headaches for people like you guys. But what about share farming opportunities? Might this new framework create or enhance existing opportunities for younger farmers and new entrants to find their feet in ag? What do you think about that?
So share farming is one of several forms of joint venture available, and in essence, it's parties sharing the resources of a farming operation and therefore sharing the risk and reward. So it's quite flexible, and the landowner can potentially give some of the machinery and capital, but it allows for the partner or new entrant to get foot on the ladder. And because of that, it's obviously an opportunity for new entrants. I think possibly not so much on its own, and there might need to be some reform on the tax system, such as relinquishing APR and BPR and the positioning of that to make more land available really to the new entrants.
Yeah.
So in theory, it's a really good concept, but in practice, it just needs tweaking a little bit.
And some new entrants, particularly say in the sheep sector, might be working with 1 year or 2 year grazing agreements with a number of different landlords. Ashley, how might the nature of new ELMS agreements impact on young farmers such as this? Obviously, there's still a lot of details still to come. We're still working with broad concepts and broad frameworks. But what about new ELMS and its relationship with new entrants?
Interesting that you pick the sheep sector as an example, Ben. I mean, obviously, there's an added layer of complexity there in terms of future trade deals with Europe. But setting that one aside and just focusing on the question at hand, being ELMS. I mean, again, it's really about how things pan out post this sort of transition period, sort of 2021 to 27. We broadly know that's the sort of the phase-out period for the current basic payment scheme. The phase-in period for the new ELMS is likely to start any time from 2024, but quite when we don't know yet, and quite over what time period, likely to be 2 or 3 years. So, you know, we're looking at something that sort of stretches out the best part of 10 years ahead of us. Potentially does make it tricky for those that are sort of working with short-term agreements. And the alternative is to try and go back to your sort of landlord or the landowner and negotiate a longer-term agreement with some sort of break or review provision as things develop. Equally, I don't know the terms of the ELM schemes. Will it be possible for tenants on short-term agreements to enter into those schemes? Historically, there have been sort of 5-year commitments. Equally, it might be difficult for landlords to enter the ELM scheme if they're not actively farming the land. So that there might have to be a deal done between the parties and some sort of rebalancing of payments, specifically on the rent.
There could be a lot of pragmatism with this. I mean, have you got any examples in previous schemes where the landlord has taken previous stewardship payments in return for charging a lower grazing fee, say?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. You know, we've seen arrangements where effectively the rent is zero because the landlord is taking the stewardship payment. We've seen other situations where the stewardship payment is shared between the parties, particularly where the tenant is required to do some of the work to comply with the scheme. So, I mean, it's really back to some of the things that Georgina's been saying about share farming. Even in other contexts, there needs to be this attitude that you're sort of sharing risks and benefits.
There are some key skills that aren't going to be significantly impacted by the changes. They were as important 50 years ago as they are today, and they will be in another 50 years. What are those key business skills that new entrants and next generation farmers should be learning, do you think? And how do they go about doing this? Georgina, do you want to go on this one?
There's actually quite a few skills that haven't changed over the past 50 years. And one of them is just basic financial skills and basic planning. So being able to produce a gross margin and understand what costs go into the gross margin, and also a basic understanding of profit and loss. Because if you can't understand your finances and if you can't really work out if you've made a profit or a loss, it's quite hard to be successful because you don't know where your business is going. And that ties into nicely having a good business plan with clear objectives that you can go back to every so often. You can check that you're on the right path and you're heading in the right direction. And I think having a network of advisors and a trusted team is really important. You have someone, whether it be a neighbour or a professional advisor like myself and Ashley, where you can just pick up the phone, ask them for advice, just use them as a good sounding board, really.
Absolutely.
And I think another really important point is cash is king. If you don't have good cash flow, it's quite hard to buy new stock, expand, that sort of thing. And cash was key 50 years ago, and I imagine it's going to be key for another 150 years.
Yeah, I think that those are all really, really key points. Especially, I think, dare I say, that idea of not being frightened of asking for advice, isn't it? That you don't need to. This doesn't need to be a journey that just for you to do. There are other people out there who will willingly help you when you're planning a new venture, whether that be as a prospective tenant, a new entrant, or within a family farming framework. Ashley, what are the key points that you need to think about in terms of business planning?
Quite a lot of the points that Georgina has already mentioned are relevant here, Ben. And I suppose the one I would emphasise, and has been reiterated to me throughout all my career, is that cash really is king. Over and above that, forecasts need to be realistic. No point pitching at a level that's never going to be achieved. Allow a buffer. That's quite often termed sort of sensitivity analysis, but it's just that sort of buffer if things don't quite go to plan, that you've still got enough spare cash available within the system. And I guess the one thing that COVID has reminded us all, expect the unexpected.
Absolutely. That is such an important point. Yeah, who knows? Especially when you're starting a new venture, dare I say it as well. Let's think about timelines here. In terms of changes to the system, but Elms specifically, if listeners are interested in that, can you outline the general timeline towards these changes?
Yeah, I mean, we expect that there will be pilot schemes for Elms starting probably next year, 2021. From what we've seen from Defra, there's potentially 40 pilot schemes going to start around England, with a view to sort of the main scheme being launched sometime between 2024 and 2026. Obviously, there's an overlap, there's an overlay with the basic payment scheme being phased out, likely starting 2021 through to 2027, 2028, with the reduced payments over that period effectively declining to zero at the end of the phasing period. So we've got some broad timelines. Obviously, the details still to be sorted out.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly this isn't going to happen overnight, and subsidy payments are going to transition through the decade. So what can new entrants and younger farmers do during this transition time to make sure that they remain resilient, there's that word again, and focused on what they want to achieve?
I mean, there are so many unknowns. I think really all we can advise, Ben, is that you have your plan, you stick to it as best you can, and you critically analyse it as you go along. That includes understanding the implications of all the sort of current negotiations around Brexit and what's going on in Brussels and trade deals with the likes of the US. There's a lot to take in, but, my advice would be to sort of follow the news and understand what is happening in terms of trade arrangements, and something Georgina alluded to earlier on, also what consumers are doing and looking for, and general consumer trends.
Yeah. Georgina, would you go along with that?
Yeah, to mirror what Ashley said, really. And also, as I touched on earlier, use your trusted advisor sounding board. They might not have lived through COVID before, but I'm sure they've been through some rough patches too. And if you have a good idea, then just talk it through with them and go through the risks involved and just see if it's worth doing, really.
Ashley, you mentioned earlier that cash is king and funding is clearly critical in starting a new business. How do you go about accessing that initial capital required to start your business? And how friendly are the banks towards new entrants and new ventures in agriculture? Georgina?
I think it's all about building relationships. So get out there and get to know your local agricultural managers from banks, attend events that they're doing, and really just get to know them and have a more personal approach with them, understand their role and what they do for the bank. And then by understanding their role, you'll be able to understand how your part in that process. So if you do want some lending or some information from them, be timely with your requests and also realistic, and hopefully by that point you'll have built up a bit of their trust and they'll be willing to help you. I think don't go in there on day one and ask to borrow X thousands of pounds, because that might not work. But if you build up a relationship with them over time, I think they'll be very helpful towards you.
What about capital grant opportunities in the context of tenancies? Should the landlord apply on behalf of the tenant, and how might the benefits be shared? Capital grants, Ashley?
again, Ben, we're sort of in that sort of waiting phase. Obviously, waiting on the detail. Can draw some lessons from what's gone before in terms of opportunities under Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy. There are likely to be opportunities, particularly around sort of technology and sort of being able to measure and monitor. So I know a very popular grant item on a number of the businesses I'm involved with have been things like cattle crushers and weigh scales. I mean, there is a general sort of direction of travel indicated within the agricultural bill, sort of schemes that will supplement ELMS centred around farm productivity, animal welfare and producer organisations. So producer organisations is where a group of producers sort of collaborate and club together towards a sort of a common aim. So, yeah, I'm sure there will be opportunities. Again, we just need to understand the detail as to whether it's going to really be easier for the landlord or the tenant or some sort of joint initiative to access funding.
Mm. I mean, Georgina, there's already some examples, there's some existing examples of similar schemes in Wales, for example, that have been working well.
Yeah, so in Wales, there's the Farming Connect scheme, which Ashley knows a lot more about than me, with it being in his part of the world. But then within England as well, we've had the Countryside Productivity Small Grant Scheme, which is, as Ashley alluded to, you can go on and get money towards certain items, whether it be a cattle crush, a GPS for a tractor, and things like that, which for new entrants, it's been really valuable. And we've seen a really high take-up in that grant scheme.
What about other grants? How might a new entrant to Next Generation Farmer or a prospective tenant go about looking for and achieving other grant funding? Obviously, as you've said, we're still waiting on the detail of where this might be, but perhaps existing grants and looking just taking that first step to actually see what's available. What could they do?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot going on in terms of sort of the various COVID recovery initiatives. So the first tip would be to keep an eye on the various websites, particularly sort of Defra and the Treasury websites, to see what is available and applicable to farming businesses. I think you can do worse than sort of read the farming press and just scan through relevant websites that might direct you to sources of funding. Obviously, National Federation of Young Farmers would be a good option.
Absolutely.
Other sort of sources of that type of information, the Prince's Trust is always a good place to go and look. They have various initiatives. And sometimes local authorities, local authorities do pop up with typically smaller pots of money, but it's always good to keep an eye on what's happening locally.
What about Savills and any future training events that you might have? Can you tell listeners about the offer that Savills and NFYFC currently have for a 30-minute Zoom training session on business and tenancy issues?
So as we have lost the personal touch with going to the event, which we really enjoyed, we thought it would be a really good idea. So people that have listened to this podcast for a short term can have a one-to-one phone or Zoom session with myself or Ashley to discuss their ideas and their business plan outline, and just we'll give you some hints and tips for 30 minutes. It'll be completely free of charge, and it'll just signpost you in the right direction, really, and just hopefully give you a bit more detailed information that we might not have been able to provide on the podcast. If we'd have had the training sessions, we would have been there to answer then. Yeah. So the NFYFC website will signpost you with how to sign up to that.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. I'm hoping that lots of young farmers will sign up for that and take advantage of that. Finally, can you each give listeners one top tip for putting themselves on the best possible footing moving forwards with their venture, whatever that might be?
So if I can go first, Ben, I think my one would be really don't be afraid to ask for help. I know land agents and consultants and bank managers might appear a little bit on the scary side, but actually, we've all been there, and we've all appreciated the help and the guidance we've had through our careers, or I have in particular. We're all willing to give some of our time to help people just at the start of their farming career. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help.
That's brilliant. Georgina?
I think from me, it would be to have a realistic plan. I think we've hammered it home enough in this podcast, but if you have a realistic plan that sets out your objectives and your goals, it's something that you can always go back to, you can expand on it, but it's a really good starting point.
Yeah. Ashley and Georgina, thank you for your time and for your help for everyone listening. A reminder to anyone who is listening that you can check out the business and tenancy training presentation, which is attached to the webpage where you found this podcast. On behalf of NFYFC and Savills, we hope that you found this podcast recording useful, and please do encourage others to listen to it if you got something from it. Also, don't forget about that offer from Savills that Georgina mentioned. There are details of this on the same page. We wish you all the best with your future business venture or tenancy application. For now, though, it's goodbye from Ashley, Georgina, and me, and thank you very much for listening. This podcast was produced and presented by Ben Eagle. There was further input from Savills, and it was produced for the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs. It was funded by Defra, and special thanks to Sarah Palmer from NFYFC for further input.